Greenwall. Tom hunched over his fiddle, trying once again to coax something merry out of the gut strings. But it squealed more than it sang. A few market-goers slowed, curious or pitying, but none dropped coin. One shaggy mule stared longer than any man. "Bastard," Tom muttered, not to the mule but to the fiddle, and slung it back into its weather-beaten case. He reached instead for the more agreeable lute, tuned just this morning after he bartered for fresh gut. The air was warm, buzzed with horseflies, and smelled of roasted onion and fish sauce. Tom plucked a few light notes and cleared his throat. In Greenwall town where the red fires burn and the coins of fate all twist and turn. Beware the smile that hides a blade, and boots that fall where none have strayed. It was an old Dregs Club drinking song. Locals knew it, so it always drew at least a hum. Two porters clapped. One of the alewives smiled. Tom nodded, fingers warming. That's when he saw it. Across the street, standing perfectly still amid the bustle of midday, a figure, garbed in layered grey leathers, face half concealed beneath a wide cowl. The man wasn't looking at anyone, yet everyone seemed to unconsciously avoid him. He moved only once, to adjust a short cloak clasped high, where a peculiar stone-carved insignia sat like a brooch. Tom's gut dropped. Stonefist. He hadn't seen one since Mornhollow. And that was not in this realm. The Stonefist didn't belong here, not in Greenwall, not in Yyth at all. The Dregs Club ran these streets. Blood quietly flowed when borders were crossed. Tom strummed once, missed a chord, and hissed. Then, impulsively, he stood tall on his little crate and shouted across the street. "You're on the wrong continent!" Heads turned. Some laughed, assuming it part of the act. Others blinked in confusion, eyes flicking to the figure in grey. The Stonefist looked directly at Tom. No expression, no movement. Then the crowd swallowed him. Two merchants passed by hauling sacks, a donkey reared up at a stray dog, and he was gone. Tom's song died unfinished. He hopped down, packed the lute and slung his case. No more tunes today. Not when shadows had names. Not when killers wore stone. He needed to find Frederick. No more delaying. The rogue would want to hear this. The Church of Balder. The Church of Balder sat high at the crest of Flint Rise. Whitewashed stone and green gold glass glowing in late sun. Peace lived here, or was meant to. Light prayers drifted from open arches, and bees hummed in the flowering vines along the columns. Inside, the soft sounds of cleaning and scripture marked the end of day. The doors were not locked. The Stonefist did not knock. He entered as a shadow in grey, quiet as falling ash. Each footstep placed with reverent stillness. One might have mistaken him for a pilgrim. But none of the faithful here had lived through the wars east of the Saltarine Divide. 1. A junior cantor polished the altar rail, humming a hymn off-key. She didn't hear him behind her until the dust filled her lungs. A whisper of white blown from his sleeve. She blinked once, choked, and buckled, mouth frozen in a gasp. Her hands trembled before going limp on the cloth. The Stonefist caught her head before it hit the floor. He placed it gently to one side and moved on. 2. A groundskeeper sweeping the vestibule turned at the creak of leather. He tried to speak, but the garrote was already around his throat. The assassin didn't pull fast. He drew tight in silence, leaning in so close. The dying man could hear his own last heartbeats echoed in his killer's chest. The broom clattered. 3. The girl reading scriptures in the small library never felt the prick of the poisoned pin that brushed her finger as she turned a page. She died 2 minutes later, convulsing among the parables of mercy. The Stonefist placed her book back on the shelf and aligned the spine with the others. 4. The deacon passing through the side chapel barely registered the figure ahead before the Stonefist stepped close and plunged a dagger upward beneath the chin, through soft flesh and silence. The body slid down the wall, leaving a red smear like a forgotten blessing. 5. In the sacristy, a senior priest prepared the chalice for tomorrow's rites. He turned, startled, only to be struck in the chest by the corner of the Great Canon of Balder, the ceremonial tome weighing near 30 pounds. The impact broke ribs. A second blow crushed the throat. On the third, the skull gave way, blood and parchment mingling across sacred words. The book was returned to the altar. Still open. Still legible. 6. The head cleric, Father Callum, had hidden behind the winepress. He clutched an ivory talisman, whispering old rites in trembling breath. He knew. The Stonefist found him and dragged him out by his ankle. He laid out the man's tools of faith, a relic, a blade of sanctified copper, and an iron candlestick, and began his work. He started with the fingers, each joint dislocated and folded backward, tendon by tendon. Then the tongue, cut, not removed, to allow for screams. He opened the abdomen and placed a small burning censer inside, sealed it with twine and linen. Callum did not die quickly. He thrashed, wept, vomited blood prayers. The Stonefist sat and watched until the priest's eyes stopped pleading and began to hollow. Only then did he rise. In the narthex, he found the water-bearer, a stammering, pale-faced boy no older than 12 who had hidden under the basin. He said nothing. He only extended a hand. And the boy, shaking, took it. Room by room, corpse by corpse. The Stonefist walked him through it, showed him each fallen servant. The altar, the chapel, the blood-slick book. Not once did he hasten. The boy tried to look away. He was not allowed. At the end, in the echoing center of the church, the boy dropped to his knees, eyes wide with trauma and disbelief. Only then did the Stonefist speak. "It is done?" He walked out beneath the bells that tolled for evening mass. No one stopped him. No one knew he'd been there, except the boy and the dead. The Red Cap Inn. Evening had deepened into that hazy hour, when the drunk and desperate blurred together. From the road, the Red Cap Inn looked inviting. Lanterns flickered in amber light, smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, and the unmistakable sound of laughter, dice, and skin slapping skin pulsed from its warped wooden frame. The Stonefist entered without fanfare. His cloak, mottled grey and brown, was dusted from the road. He passed unnoticed through the front taproom, where the air was thick with sweat and spilt ale. His boots barely creaked on the floorboards. He moved to the stew pot. The cook, a bulbous man stirring the meaty slurry, gave a grunt and looked away for only a moment. A small vial, clear as raindrop glass, emptied into the pot without a sound. The poison was odorless, colorless, and had a bitter aftertaste that no one would question over boiled barley and turnip. The first patron, a caravan guard with a weathered pauldron, slumped forward within minutes, face landing in his trencher. 2 more collapsed to the floor, amid gasps and wet retching. One woman shrieked as her brother's eyes rolled back. Another clutched his throat, stood, and toppled into the hearth. 5. Dead from stew. None of them aware. The Stonefist walked past the growing panic. He climbed the stairs slowly, 1 foot at a time, pausing only once to look at a nail driven too high into the railing. He reached the 2nd floor, where the bedrooms lined the hall. The first door opened easily. A man in breeches rolled aside from the bed, sweat still fresh on his back. A faint whimper from the girl on the mattress. She pulled a blanket around herself. The sword slid from its sheath. The man barely gasped before his throat was opened. The blood sprayed across the wall in a diagonal arc. He moved room to room. The second, a fat merchant snoring atop a pillow. His eyes opened too late. The sword entered through his gut and twisted up to the ribs. The third, a soldier still in his boots, drunk and groping. His death was violent, messier. Body slammed into the wall hard enough to crack plaster. The fourth, a farmer who tried to fight back with a fire iron. The Stonefist took his wrist, broke it, and drove the blade into his sternum, then turned it once, precisely. The fifth, a gambler with dice in his fist and a prostitute on his lap. She fled screaming. He died screaming. 10. Total now. No survivors upstairs, only wails from the women, scrambling for anything to wear. The Stonefist descended again. The taproom had thinned. Half had fled. The bartender stood frozen, pale as milk, hand on the counter. The assassin reached into his pouch and placed a gold bar on the wood. Heavy. No words. Then he walked into the kitchen. 3 workers still moved inside. 2 slicing root vegetables, 1 washing trays. They turned, startled. He took the first knife from his hand and stabbed him through the neck in one motion. The second tried to back away. He slipped on grease and met the blade in the belly. The third lunged with a cleaver, but the Stonefist parried and drove the kitchen knife up beneath his chin, pinning him to the wall like meat. By now, the inn was chaos. Those with enough wit to run had, but not all. The drunk, the cowardly, the stunned, they cowered in corners, sobbing, some muttering prayers to gods who weren't listening. From the far end of the taproom, two figures rose. A dwarf, thick with muscle and rage, lifted a stone maul from under the table. Beside him, a half-orc, eyes bloodshot but clear with anger, unsheathed a greatsword longer than most men were tall. "You've killed enough," the dwarf growled. "Time to stop that heart of yours, whatever it is." The half-orc said nothing. He flexed his jaw and rolled his shoulders. The Stonefist didn't charge. He didn't answer. He simply tilted his head, observing them like curios in a market stall. Then he walked away, slowly, through the splintered back doorway. A few moments passed. The dwarf looked at the half-orc. "He's getting away." But they hadn't noticed the side staircase. The Stonefist moved like smoke through the side hall, upstairs then, over the roof beam, and down again into the hallway near the privy. They heard a creak behind them. Too late. Quartermaster's chamber. Later that night, under a moon smeared with clouds, Greenwall felt uneasy. The wind was still. The kind of stillness known only before storms. The Stonefist moved across the western rooftops, like a shadow layered on other shadows. His boots found grip where others would slip. No armor clanked. No leather squeaked. He was wrapped in dusk, and dusk had let him in. The quadrant commander's quarters were built like a fortress, but guarded like a barracks. Stone exterior, wooden halls, lantern lit, lazy. He entered through the third-story window where shutters creaked but no one checked. Inside, the quarters of Commander Darim Van, whose name stirred fear in petty criminals and reverence among the town guard, but tonight, the man snored. The Stonefist crossed the room, drawing a blade as short as a letter opener, as sharp as shame. He placed one gloved hand on the commander's mouth, lightly, like a lover, and slit the throat in a clean line. Not too deep, not too shallow, just enough to let the blood bubble upward without waking the room. He waited until the gurgling stopped, then turned. Descending the stairs, he found two guards stationed by the stairwell, chatting about dice or women, he never knew which. From his sleeve, a puff of choking dust bloomed. They inhaled reflexively. Coughs tore from them. Their eyes went red. They clawed at their throats like men on fire. He walked calmly past them and reached the front door. They staggered after him, half blind, wheezing. He turned, expression unreadable, and placed one hand on each of their shoulders. He leaned in slightly. Sleep. They collapsed like sacks of grain. Whether dead or unconscious, it didn't matter. They'd seen nothing. Minutes later, the watchtower, Greenwall's western beacon, stood unmanned in the eyes of the town. But the Stonefist had already climbed the outer beams, avoiding the spiral stairs. He reached the top, where two guards stood bickering about whose shift it was to haul water. They didn't hear him land behind them. One turned just as he was grabbed by the collar and thrown clean over the ledge, a scream flailing downward before it was snapped by silence. The second lunged with a spear. The Stonefist sidestepped and disarmed him with one motion, then shoved him backward over the ledge. He didn't watch them fall. Instead, he produced a small torch, flint already struck. With calm hands, he opened the cask of lantern oil stored beneath the signal flags and let it drizzle across the floorboards, slick and glistening. He stepped away from the pool, dropped the torch, and descended before the fire caught air. Flames licked upward in seconds, feeding fast. By the time the bells began to ring, the fire was already speaking for him. Eastern Port. Dawn. In the port east of Greenwall, the first rays of sun crept over the horizon, gilding the surf in burnished gold. Seagulls cried above slanted roofs. Nets hung drying from poles, and salt-crusted ropes swayed gently with the morning tide. Here, where the light first touched the land of Yyth, men were already hauling crates, scrubbing decks and cursing hangovers. Few noticed the cloaked figure walking the docks, grey as morning mist, face hidden by a weathered hood. The Stonefist arrived at the harbormaster's office, just as the lanterns were being snuffed. Inside, Telen Vusk, the harbormaster, sipped from a chipped ceramic mug and scribbled onto a manifest. He looked up once, just once. A dirk plunged into his temple with enough force to splinter bone. The mug shattered. Ink spilled. His body slumped sideways into his desk with a soft groan. No sound escaped the room. Guard 1 came next, stretching outside the office. A garrote slipped silently around his neck from behind, cutting off both air and scream. The body was propped against a post, eyes wide. Guard 2 heard something and stepped around the corner. A flash of movement, a dagger to the gut, upward and hard, turned the man into a pile of crumpled armor and twitching limbs. Guard 3 and 4 were together, walking patrol. The Stonefist stepped from behind a coiled net and raised one hand. A whisper of arcane breath passed his lips, and the air around the two men shimmered like a mirage, then snapped. Both men froze, backs arched in locked rigor, eyes bleeding black tears before collapsing forward, lifeless. A spell of seizure and stillness, learned long ago and rarely used, but effective. A dockhand on a stack of crates saw too much. The Stonefist caught him before he could yell. He twisted the man's wrist backward, pulled him down by the throat, and crushed the larynx with the heel of his palm. Another tried to flee. He was chased down silently and flung into the water, his head hitting the side of a skiff with a sickening crack. The ship was moored at the far pier, a medium-sized freighter called Helga's Bosom. Broad-beamed and weather-beaten, it looked like it had seen more storms than calm waters. A deckhand was coiling rope at the port bow when the Stonefist landed silently aboard. The man turned and was struck 3 times with unarmed blows to the solar plexus, chin and temple. Each hit surgical. The man collapsed like cloth. Another deckhand tried to shout a warning. The assassin threw a dagger underhanded, straight through the man's mouth. He tumbled backward over the railing. The second mate, hearing the noise, stepped out from below deck and caught a sword slash across the chest, horizontal, precise, severing ribs from spine. The first mate came barreling from the captain's stair, blade in hand. The Stonefist caught the swing on the flat of his forearm brace, stepped in, spun, and drove his blade across the man's throat in a fluid arc. Blood sprayed across the wheel. Silence returned. Only one figure remained. The captain, a thick-shouldered woman with gold in her teeth and fury in her eyes, stood on the aft deck, saber drawn, feet planted. Her coat was half-buttoned, her jaw clenched. The Stonefist walked toward her, one deliberate step after another, then stopped 10 paces away. Without a word, he raised his sword slowly, held upright in both hands. A challenge. The captain spat over the side. And charged. The duel was short but honorable, at least in form. She struck twice, both parried. Her third strike caught his cloak, but he pivoted, drew her momentum, past him, and brought the hilt of his sword up beneath her chin. Her head snapped back. She staggered. He stepped inside, slammed her elbow with his forearm, disarming her, then shoved her against the mast. She reached for a hidden knife. He kicked her knee sideways and spun her into a full turn, then ran his blade up beneath her ribs, fast and deep, into the heart. She froze, shuddered, exhaled. The Stonefist held her upright as she slid down, blood dripping down her front like spilled wine. No one else rose. No one else came above deck. He cleaned his blade on her coat, sheathed it, and walked to the helm. He looked east into the morning sun. Not a word spoken. Harbour Town. Evening settled slow over Harbour Town, the horizon bleeding red and orange into the darkening sea. Lanterns glowed in swinging lines along the piers, swaying with the wind like lazy watchmen's eyes. The Helga's Bosom, now unmanned but very much aflame, sailed her final course under borrowed heat. Her sails, soaked in lantern oil and bitumen, caught fire mid-channel, as she turned slowly, intentionally, toward another moored vessel. A merchant cutter, her name unrecorded, had no chance to avoid the collision. The crash was muted by the roar of flames. Wood splintered. Canvas bloomed into fire. Both ships hissed as their hulls cracked and sagged into the harbour's embrace. From a different stretch of pier, something broke the surface. A single figure rose in silence. The stone fist emerged from the black water, bone dry. His cloak rustled, unsoaked, as if the sea had rejected him. His right hand shimmered faintly pink, a faint afterglow from the simple spell. A utility enchantment, old and forgotten, made not to protect flesh but dry it. Just one more tool. He moved silently onto the dock, past drifting smoke and distant shouts. He had business. The harbour master's office in Harbourtown was newer than Greenwall's. 2 stories. Whitewashed boards, blue tile roof. A bell hung above the door that no one ever rang except drunks or smugglers. Inside, 3 men. The harbour master, Sen Gala, red-vested, balding cleaning spectacles at his desk, and 2 guards, leaning against the side wall, dice in one hand and mild boredom in the other. The Stonefist stepped through the door, and for a moment, no one registered his presence. He was so calm, so still, that their minds took an extra beat to catch up. By the time they did, his sword was drawn. The first guard reached for a short sword, but the Stonefist cleaved his wrist, from his arm, then reversed the blade and drove it through his chest. The motion was clean, almost slow. A breath later, the man collapsed without a word. The second guard, faster, raised his axe. He managed to swing. The Stonefist pivoted, caught the haft against his own blade's flat, and turned into a shoulder check, knocking the man into the wall. A single diagonal stroke followed, hip to shoulder, cutting through armor, flesh, and finally wood. The wall held. The man didn't. Sen Gala, the harbour master, was already on his feet, fumbling for something in a drawer, perhaps a wand or a flare. The Stonefist walked to him. There was no hurry. The harbour master held up a ledger in shaking hands, as if some bureaucratic shield could stay death. The sword answered, a single thrust, just under the sternum, angled up. The breath left Sen's mouth in a single wheeze. The blade stayed there a moment, buried in books and blood. Then it withdrew, and the man fell across his own desk. The Stonefist turned to the shelves, found the little oil lamp, and tipped it with surgical grace. Flames licked upward. He stepped to the back corner, and struck flint to another curtain. The fire grew steadily, unhurried. No explosions, just steady consumption. Paper curled. Wood crackled. He stood in the center of the room for a moment, watching, then turned and walked out the front door, past the crumpled bodies, through the golden spill of firelight now stretching across the dock. He moved into Harbourtown proper, as the sky turned from dusk to bruised blue. The sword, still wet with blood, trailed slightly in his hand, not dragging, not forgotten, but carried like a brush awaiting the next stroke. Church of Balder, Harbourtown. Evening draped the church in amber and blue. Stained glass flickered with the last light of day, casting fractured saints across the nave. Incense still hung in the air, like the breath of old prayers. The Church of Balder in Harbourtown was quieter than its sister in Greenwall. No sermons this night, just private devotions, a few faithful filing through rituals. The Stonefist was already inside. First, a scribe in the side alcove noticed a soft scuff of footfall behind him, then nothing. A faint pressure around his neck, brief confusion, the snap of the garrote. His body slumped silently onto a sheaf of half-transcribed hymns. Second, a young acolyte bent over a basin, scrubbing brass with vinegar and ash. She coughed, then coughed again, harsher. White dust spilled from a vent high in the wall. She gripped her throat and collapsed, twitching violently in a silent prayer for air that never came. Third, a bell ringer dozed in the loft. The Stonefist scaled the narrow ladder behind him. One hand clasped his mouth, the other pressed a slender dagger through the throat. The bell never tolled. Fourth, a groundskeeper in the cloister garden paused mid-prayer, a wooden symbol clutched in his calloused hands. The assassin dropped from a shadowed archway and buried a curved dirk into the back of the man's neck. He didn't cry out, only twitched once, and fell into his lavender beds. Fifth and sixth, two mid-tier clerics finishing vespers together. One sipped consecrated water. The other drew back a curtain, blinking at the dusk. The poisoned drink took one. A dagger under the ribs took the other before he could cry warning. Last, the head cleric sat in his private study, hunched over an illuminated manuscript, surrounded by tomes and candlelight. He turned too late. The stone fist had already crossed the room. The blade went through the priest's hand first, pinning it to the desk. A second cut severed 2 fingers. The man screamed. The stone fist said nothing. He twisted the blade. Then drew another, short, thin, more for pain than death. The work was quiet, clinical. Tendons, kneecaps, eyes. The torture did not last long. It never needed to. The water-bearer, a boy of no more than 12, was found, clutching a cup he dropped, hands trembling. The stone fist placed one hand on the boy's shoulder. With slow precision he walked him to each corpse, one by one, guiding him like a curator through a gallery of death. The boy's breath caught. He tried not to sob. Failed. At the last body, the high cleric's mutilated form, the stone fist turned and finally spoke. "It is done." And then, he was gone. Harbour Town. Nightfall crept slow across Harbour Town, dragging a salt breeze and the heavy scent of oil from the docks. The streets had quieted. Lanterns hung low. Crickets whispered beneath the boards. The Red Cap Inn bustled with laughter, music and pipe smoke. No one noticed the man outside. No one noticed the iron spikes driven quietly through hinges, or the hammer tapping shut the back cellar door. When the torch flared bright and touched the eaves, it danced like a red moth, then caught with a soft hiss. The stone fist moved on before the first scream rose. The magistrate's home was a stately old manor with imported tiles and a balcony that once hosted peace talks. The front door was barred from within, but the assassin didn't enter. He climbed to the second story, left a lit oil pouch on the sill, and kicked the supports from beneath it. Flame rolled inward like a hungry beast. The screams here started faster. At the guardhouse, 2 men smoked near the door, bored and careless. They saw him. One stepped forward, hand on hilt. That man was first. His throat slit and body caught before it hit the ground. The second turned to run. He didn't make the corner before the blade found his spine. The rest burned with the building. From the eastern ridge, the stone fist watched it all. The inn collapsing inward, the manor belching. Smoke through stained glass, the guardhouse lighting the night like a funeral pyre. He stood beneath a leaning pine, arms at his sides, face lit amber in the blaze. No sound escaped him. No joy, no fury, no sorrow, only fire and silence. Yyth. He wrote. By ash and coals in a ruined hearth, with a stylus of bone on vellum, too fine for the woods, he wrote in a cipher long out of fashion, neat, controlled, no flourishes. He sealed it in wax, and left it in a half-collapsed chapel by the road, under a carved idol no one prayed to anymore. He resupplied. Not with coin, but with stillness. He took what was left abandoned. A full waterskin from an overgrown shrine, dried fruit from a windowsill, a pair of leather boots too fine for the tanner's boy they were meant for. No locks were broken, no signs left behind, only that they were missing. Then he headed toward Magetown. The first village, Featherdale, saw him just past dawn. He stood at the well while children fetched buckets. One ran. One froze. The baker's wife watched him from behind shuttered eyes. He didn't speak. He drank. Then moved on. In Redridge, a hunter passed him on the trail. The man tipped his head and said something polite, something about the weather. The stone fist said nothing. Just looked. The hunter forgot what he'd said. At Two Forks, the tavern stopped laughing when he passed the window. He bought nothing. Asked for nothing. But every stool by the hearth emptied after he left. In Strawmire, a guard on the wall saw him crossing the eastern field. The next morning, 4 mules were saddled, and 20 villagers packed as if a storm were coming. They didn't know why. They only knew they had seen him. No one was harmed. No blade drawn. No words spoken. Just a man in grey, silent, precise, drifting across the land like a shadow that refused to attach itself to any wall. By the time he reached the smoke-ringed outskirts of Magetown, whispers ran ahead of him. They called him many things: the Pale Walker, the Silent Burn, the Sword with no sheath. Most did not know his face. But they knew the hush that followed. They knew what came next. He walked through the outer market. Eyes lowered. Voices faded. The stone fist had arrived.